What if I told you that inflation isn't just rising prices, but the most sophisticated wealth redistribution system ever created? One that quietly takes money from your wallet and deposits it directly into the accounts of the richest people in society? Most people think inflation is like weather, something that just happens naturally due to supply and demand. But that's exactly what they want you to believe. The truth is that inflation is a deliberate policy tool, carefully orchestrated by central banks and governments to transfer wealth from the bottom 90% of society to the top 1%, all while convincing the victims that it's either necessary for economic growth or simply unavoidable. Every time you hear that inflation is running at 3%, 5%, or 8%, what you're really hearing is an announcement of how much of your purchasing power is being confiscated and redistributed to asset owners, corporations, and financial institutions. This isn't accidental, it's the most perfect crime in history, because the victims actually thank their oppressors for stealing from them, believing they're being protected from something worse. Think about it. When was the last time you heard a politician, economist, or financial expert explain that inflation is actually theft? Or that there's a direct mathematical relationship between the money being taken from your paycheck and the profits flowing to Wall Street? They don't, because the entire economic establishment benefits from your ignorance about how this wealth transfer mechanism actually works. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly who profits from inflation, how they engineer it to maximize their gains, and why this system represents the largest theft in human history, one that makes every bank robbery, corporate fraud, and government scandal look like pocket change by comparison. To understand how inflation works as a wealth transfer system, we need to examine Weimar Germany in the early 1920s, where hyperinflation created the most dramatic example of systematic wealth redistribution in modern history. After World War I, Germany faced crushing war reparations, demanded by the Treaty of Versailles, payments so enormous that the government couldn't possibly meet them through normal taxation without triggering immediate revolution. So they chose what seemed like an easier path. They began printing marks to pay their debts, creating money out of thin air rather than extracting it from their citizens directly. At first, this seemed to work. The government could meet its obligations, businesses could pay workers, and economic activity continued. But what happened next reveals the true mechanics of inflation as theft. As more marks flooded the economy, each individual mark became worth less, meaning prices rose across the board. However, this wasn't just a general rise in living costs, it was a systematic transfer of wealth from anyone holding cash or earning fixed incomes to anyone holding real assets or owing fixed debts. The wealthy, who owned factories, land, and businesses, saw their assets rise in nominal value while their debts became worthless. Industrial magnates like Hugo Stinnes became extraordinarily rich by borrowing marks to buy real assets, then repaying those loans with worthless paper. Meanwhile, middle-class Germans who had saved money in banks, held government bonds, or lived on pensions watched their life savings evaporate. A retirement account that could have supported a family for decades became insufficient to buy a loaf of bread. The currency became so worthless that workers demanded to be paid twice daily so they could spend their wages before they lost more value. And people literally carried wheelbarrows full of cash to buy basic necessities. The Weimar hyperinflation revealed the brutal mathematics of wealth transfer through currency debasement, and the human cost was devastating for ordinary Germans while being extraordinarily profitable for the connected elite. By 1923, prices were doubling every few days, and a single US dollar was worth over 4 trillion German marks. But this astronomical number tells only part of the story. The real story is in who gained and who lost during this monetary chaos. Workers and pensioners saw their purchasing power completely destroyed, life savings accumulated over decades vanished in months, and anyone on a fixed income faced literal starvation as their money became worthless faster than they could spend it. But for those who understood the system, hyperinflation was the greatest wealth redistribution opportunity in German history. Industrialists borrowed heavily in marks to buy factories, mines, and real estate, then watched those debts disappear as the currency collapsed while their assets retained real value. Foreign investors with hard currencies could buy entire German companies for pocket change, essentially purchasing decades of German labor and resources at fire sale prices. The government itself was complicit in this transfer because inflation allowed them to pay off their war debts with worthless paper, while the real burden fell on German savers and workers who had no way to protect themselves. What's most revealing is that this wasn't just an unfortunate side effect of monetary policy, it was the intended outcome. The German government chose hyperinflation specifically because it transferred the cost of war reparations from the state to ordinary citizens, while enriching those politically connected enough to position themselves on the right side of the wealth transfer. By 1924, when the currency was finally stabilized, an entirely new class structure had emerged. Those who had held real assets became wealthy beyond imagination, while the former middle class had been reduced to poverty, creating the economic desperation that would later fuel political extremism. Today's inflation operates through the exact same wealth transfer mechanism as Weimar Germany, but with more sophisticated camouflage and global reach that makes the redistribution less visible while being far more massive in scale. Since 2008, the Federal Reserve has created over $8 trillion through quantitative easing programs, supposedly to stabilize the economy, but the actual result has been the largest upward wealth transfer in American history. When the Fed creates new dollars and uses them to buy government bonds and mortgage-backed securities, they're not creating wealth, they're redistributing existing wealth from dollar holders to asset owners through the inflation tax. Every new dollar created dilutes the value of every existing dollar, which means your savings, wages, and purchasing power decrease, while asset prices soar beyond the reach of ordinary buyers. The statistics are staggering. Since 2008, while median household income has barely kept pace with official inflation, stock prices have tripled, real estate has doubled, and billionaire wealth has increased by over 1,000%. This isn't coincidence, it's the predictable mathematical result of monetary expansion that flows first to financial markets and only later to consumer prices. The wealthy, who own most stocks, bonds, and real estate, benefit immediately from asset price inflation, while working Americans face the delayed but inevitable cost through higher prices for housing, healthcare, education, and basic necessities. Even more insidious is how this system traps people in debt servitude. As asset prices rise faster than wages, ordinary Americans are forced to borrow money at interest rates that ensure they'll spend decades paying back loans to the very institutions that profited from the initial inflation. A house that might have cost 3 times the median income in 1970 now costs 8 times the median income, not because construction became more expensive, but because monetary expansion inflated asset prices while wages remained relatively flat. The Federal Reserve literally creates money that flows to banks and financial institutions, who then lend it back to you at interest so you can afford to buy the assets they already inflated with the money they created for free. Here's how you escape the wealth transfer trap and position yourself on the winning side. First, become a strategic debtor, not a saver. Take out fixed-rate loans to buy appreciating assets, real estate, businesses, or commodities. Then pay back those loans with inflated dollars, exactly like Hugo Stinnes did. Your mortgage becomes your best friend when inflation accelerates. Second, own assets that benefit from money printing. Stocks in companies with pricing power, precious metals, Bitcoin, and real estate in supply-constrained markets. These assets absorb the newly printed money and protect your purchasing power. Third, develop multiple income streams that rise with inflation. Start a business, invest in dividend-growing stocks, or acquire skills that command higher wages in an inflationary environment. The wealthy understand that cash is trash during wealth transfers, but debt secured by real assets is pure gold. Don't be the next Emma Weber, watching your savings evaporate while connected insiders profit from monetary manipulation. The next wealth transfer is already underway. Position yourself to benefit from it instead of becoming its victim. History doesn't repeat, but if you don't understand it, it will crush you all the same. Subscribe now, because I'm about to reveal the 3 specific assets that performed best during every historical wealth transfer, and why they're setting up for massive gains today.